Thanks everyone for coming. Welcome. Appreciate everyone showing up after lunch. I'm super excited to be here today for two very important reasons. The first one being, this is my first time presenting at VMware Explorer, so that's pretty cool. But more importantly, this is my first time presenting with my good buddy Mark here. We've known each other for a long time, and somehow I've managed to go several years without making this happen, so that's the second reason why I'm excited. So welcome. We're going to be talking about Azure Spring Apps Enterprise here and how you can make production as smooth as development with using the tools that are part of the suite of apps in Azure Spring Apps. I'm going to give you a quick second to read this disclaimer slide, and that's about it. Just by way of introduction, my name is Ryan Baxter. I'm a member of the Spring team. I've been on the Spring team since 2016. I can't believe it's been that long at this point. The entire time I've been on the Spring team, I've been working on Spring Cloud, the open source components of Spring Cloud. I've really enjoyed doing that the entire time. When I'm not writing code or working with my teammates, I do have two small kids at home, which keep me relatively busy the rest of the time, so that's my entire life. If you want to connect with me either while we're here at VMware Explorer or while we're afterwards, please reach out to me on Twitter or X or whatever it's known as now. I'm not really sure. It might be something different by the time we're done today. At Ryan J. Baxter is where you can find me there. And of course, all the code that I put out and the code that we're going to show you today is up on GitHub, on my GitHub account, so you can browse it there. We'll also have a link for you a little bit later on as well. So I'm going to let my good buddy Mark introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Hi, and I am not Ryan J. Baxter, but I aspire to be someday. My name is Mark Heckler. I was on the Spring team for a number of years, and then Microsoft and VMware played rock, paper, scissors, and Microsoft lost, so now I work at Microsoft. Just kidding. I still work with the Spring team extensively, and we partner together on things. That's kind of why we're here together today, talking about one of our efforts together that we're really proud of. I am a developer. I'm also an advocate. I have co-authored a few books, and this is the one that I've solo authored, very proud of. It was something I poured a lot of heart and soul into, and was very proud of, and it was a lot of accomplishment, a lot of pain, but it was good. You know, I had a good time with it. So if you're interested, check it out. If not, that's cool too. My repo is out on GitHub at MKHeck. I'm also a licensed instrument rated pilot, and that's what I do for fun. Among other things. But yeah, so thanks for coming today. We specifically requested the time right after lunch because we know that that's when everybody is the most awake. So we really appreciate you being here.
All right, thanks, Mark. So here's where you can find all the code today. We'll throw this up at the end of the session as well, so you don't have to worry about if you miss it. But that is all the slides that we have for you today, so I'm sure everyone's extremely happy about that, including us. We're going to spend the rest of the time in the IDE and exploring Azure Spring Apps Enterprise, or ASAE. So I always think when we're trying to explain a new technology or something like that to people, it's kind of good to level set with them and talk so we're all on common ground. And so I assume if you're here trying to learn about ASAE, you probably have at least a basic understanding of Spring Boot and Spring Cloud. Has anyone ever heard of those things before? Yeah, okay.
Couple people
cool. Maybe.
Yeah.
No. All right. Okay. So what I have here is in my IDE is a basic kind of traditional Spring Cloud microservices application. It's a fictional shopping application. It has 3 services that are part of it. You can shop for 3 different things. There's toys, there's fashion items that you can buy, and then there's some hot deals as well. And then we have a couple of kind of more what you would expect to see from a Spring Cloud application, kind of infrastructure-related components that assist alongside these things. Oh, before I forget, there's also a 4th service called the All Item Service, and that serves up all the things you could buy. So the toys, the hot deals, and the fashion items all in one request. So from the infrastructure side of things, we have a configuration server, so the Spring Cloud config server. It's backed by a GitHub repo. Nothing really fancy going on there. We have a Eureka discovery server that's going to provide service registry for these applications to discover each other. And then we have Spring Cloud Gateway here to provide a front-end access to our applications through the gateway. So I actually have all the applications up and running locally already for us here, so I'm just going to show you quickly what they do. Like I said, I'm not a very skilled developer, so they don't do anything entirely fancy or anything like that. So if we go to, and they all pretty much do the same thing. I'll try to make text as big as possible, so yell at me if you can't see something. But they just return, a set of items, right? So we have some hot deals here, and we have, for example, the toys bestseller looks very much the same, right? And then when we look at the gateway, you can then access these apps through the gateway. So if we go to fashion bestseller, we get our fashion items. If we go to hot deals, we get our hot deals, right? So nothing terribly, incredibly exciting. The all items service is probably the one that's the most exciting. So if we go there, you can see we aggregate all the data for sale from all the different services here. So diving into the code a little bit, again, there's not going to be something that's terribly interesting or exciting here or hard to understand for most people in the room, I would think. We're just using Java 17. We're using the latest version of Spring Boot 3.1.2. We're using Spring Cloud 2022.0.4. And most of these applications, like I said, they just have a REST controller inside of them. So if we look at the hot deals application, for example, you see our application class is nothing fancy, right? It's basically what you get from start.spring.io. And the hot deals class just has a @REST controller annotation and an @get mapping to / hot deals, right? And that's pretty much what the hot deals, the fashion, and the toys bestseller applications look like. So I'm gonna save some time and not show you the other ones. The all items service is a little bit different, as you might imagine, because we're aggregating data together. This is actually using Webflux instead. So if we look at the application class here, actually I'll show you the REST controller first. Again, it has a single get mapping here, but you can see here we're making 3 requests using web client here. So it's asynchronous, right? So we have 3 requests to 3 different services. And so we have a @load balanced web client bean that we've created here. So it's @load balance, so it's using Spring Cloud Load Balancer, and that is taking advantage of the Eureka service discovery to look up those the addresses or locations of the other services. So you'll notice in the UI here, we're just specifying the service names, right? So hot deals, fashion bestseller, toys bestseller. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. Basically, the web client, since it's load balanced, it goes off to the service registry, says, I need to know where this toys bestseller service is, and it comes back and says, okay, it's at this IP address or this host name or whatever, right? So it's doing that under the covers for you. You also notice, if you're kind of keen at looking at the code here, you'll notice that we have some circuit breakers. So we've wrapped all the requests to these downstream services in a circuit breaker using Spring Cloud Circuit Breaker. So if anything goes wrong, we'll trip a circuit breaker. And what happens when the circuit breaker gets tripped, we end up with this fallback response. And because, again, I'm not an incredibly talented developer, the fallback response just returns an empty list. So you'll see an empty list if the fallback gets triggered, right? So we can just take a quick demo of that, actually, that circuit breaker. If we want here, what I have, I'm also using another tool here under the covers called Chaos Monkey for Spring Boot. They basically implement chaos engineering principles for Spring Boot applications. If you're interested in learning more about it, you can go Google that and check that out. It's a really cool little tool. But one of the many things that it does is that it can inject random latency into your REST controllers. So when it's enabled, it will just randomly say, I'm going to inject a 5-second delay into the response here. And that way you can test how resilient your applications are to potential failures. And there's a whole bunch of other things, like I said, you could do. Right now it's disabled, but I can enable it by making a request to this actuator endpoint here. And once that is enabled, the toys bestseller service, which I have somewhere over here, it will randomly get some latency injected into its response. So if we hit this all items service a couple times, we should randomly see here we see the toys bestseller service took a little bit of time to come back, so the circuit breaker was tripped and we got this empty list fallback response. So that's pretty much the lay of the land as far as the application is concerned. But now we have these applications, we have them running, and now we want to get them up to the cloud. And so we want to do it using ASAE. And so Mark, what can ASAE do to help us do that?
Oh, wait, I'm not supposed to talk until 3 minutes before the end, am I?
Oh, you're on now.
Oh, shoot. Okay, well, now I'm on the spot. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, well, let me ask this. Let's back up for a second and do a quick show of hands. Who here worked with, remembers, enjoyed working with Cloud Foundry? Anyone? Oh, a few, okay. Well, Cloud Foundry, the promise behind it was to make life, I'm trying to think of the best term. I'll just use joyful for developers, because ultimately we are the most productive when we are delivering needed functionality to our customers or our community, right? So that's the real value add. When we're tweaking YAML files, we're not adding much value. When we're trying to figure out how to get something to deploy correctly and why it didn't start up and stuff, we're not really adding value. I mean, these are things that are on the critical path, but literally they're not adding specific capabilities to the people who, providing them to the people who need them. So, Cloud Foundry, unfortunately, is no more. So we have Microsoft and VMware got together a number of years ago. Actually, it was Microsoft and Pivotal early on to come together and make a platform that developers can appreciate that works for them instead of works on them, right? And that's Azure Spring Apps. Because Microsoft and VMware looked at this and said, we want something that allows you as a developer to focus on the things that you love to do, that you're most productive doing, and we want to put the platform to work on your behalf. So Azure Spring Apps has a couple different levels. We're talking primarily the Azure Spring Apps Enterprise today. Costs are low. I mean, realistically, if you look at them, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. But what we love about it as developers is the fact that you have a lot of things that provide a lot of value for us as devs. For instance, the Spring runtime, soup to nuts, end-to-end, full support. If you have a problem and you're trying to develop and deploy a Spring Boot application into the cloud, it's covered by VMware and Microsoft acting as one team working for you as well. You have, build service, you have application configuration service, you have a service registry, you have a lot of other goodies that we're going to show you today to help you make your production apps more robust, more resilient, more scalable, globally available, as well as better supported, quite frankly. So that's kind of what we're here to do, is to kind of show you some of the ways that we actually, to borrow the term spark joy, we get this, our joy sparked as well. So it's just kind of fun to share. Do you want to go ahead and look at how we do some things and maybe make that migration?
Let's do it.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Well, Ryan and I, and these examples are intentionally fairly straightforward because we didn't want to get lost in the weeds of an example and miss the real, the important stuff, the fun stuff, the interesting stuff. But we have fairly streamlined examples, and when we're moving this to the cloud, we wanted to show you kind of that end-to-end tracing and end-to-end interactions, right? Because no application is an island. And when you're a user of an application, typically it has a lot of the value that it provides is in the data. So we wanted to be able to persist and retrieve that data. So do you mind if I jump in?
No.
Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to take one of these services and we're going to database enable it. And we're going to do that on Azure Spring Apps. What we want to do is, I like to keep things, again, fairly simple because it lets me focus on the gazintas and the gazoutas and the important stuff. So I'm going to use Cosmos DB with the MongoDB API, which is just as simple as it gets and is a robust, powerful, planetary scale database. And in terms of the Spring Boot interactions, it makes it super simple. There are once you deploy something and you want to connect to the database, change databases, change locations, it's seamless. There is no code change required after that point. What we do is we create a service connector, and that's literally just introducing app, database, app. So at that point, once that connection is made, it's all handled transparently again for you in the background, so you're not having to fiddle with configuration settings and stuff at that point. So I'm going to well, actually, you know what? Let's go here to the scripts, because I need to create that first connection, and I'm going to do that and get that kicked off. It only runs a few seconds, but I don't want to have us held up by that when the time comes, when I start actually deploying the application. So I'm going to paste that in. It's a little bit sluggish, but that should work. And now I'm going to just go in and I'm going to modify one of the services. So I'm going to use the Toys bestseller app, because, I mean, look at me. I'm definitely not somebody who's into fashion. So, toys it is. And I appreciate you guys not laughing at that, because that would have really hurt my feelings. Now you did it. You just ruined it now. So I'm going to add a dependency here. I'm just going to add the Spring Boot Starter data MongoDB. That works. And then we'll refresh our dependencies here and let that do its magic. The next thing I want to do is go to the toys. That's fine. I'll do that. Hop over here. And then we're here in our application. Now, right now, there are only a couple of different classes here. One's the main application class, and one's our REST controller. And that's fine, but we're going to add a little bit to this. Again, keeping it as simple as possible.
You're going to make the text a little bigger.
Oh, yeah, we can do that. Oh, Ryan's key combinations are a little different than mine. So every time I try to just do a key shortcut, it winds up not working so well. So let's see, application, toys. There it is. Okay, so see if I can bring that back. So how do I bring up the text here?
Yeah, I can remember it.
I did one presentation with at the time, a fellow colleague who used the French Azure keyboard. And as you might imagine, Azure and QWERTY, there's enough overlap that it just lulls you into that false sense of everything's going great until it isn't. And that was just, finally I was just like, okay, if I just tell you what to type, will you type it? 'Cause I'm running into wall after wall here. Okay, so we've got bigger text, that's good. Now I'm gonna expand this just a smidge. Okay, so, yeah, let's go ahead and add a new class. And, oops, that's not what I want. There we go. So we'll add a toy class. And I'm going to, again, keep this very simple. A toy is I started to type what I'm saying, is a kind of product. And we actually have a product class that I'm going to extend. And we can have a discussion about that at a later time, but toy is a product, so we're just going to go with that. I'm also going to, again, fumble with the keystrokes, that's fine. And I'm going to create a constructor here. I'm going to just use this. I'm not going to pass in a category, though, because I know that this is going to be a product category of toys, so that's fine. And then, of course, since we're going to want to save this in a Cosmos DB database, I'm going to make this a document class, right? So that's pretty good. That's a start. That's our domain. Again, it's a fairly simple domain, but simple by design. I'm also going to create a product repository, and we'll make this an interface. Once again, I will actually extend Spring Data's CRUD repository here. And we're going to be storing items of type product with IDs of type long, and that gets us everything we need to implement a repository, a proxy bean to interact with our data store on our behalf. Again, whatever it is, doesn't necessarily have to be Cosmos DB. As long as it supports a Mongo API, we're good to go with that. And then I'm going to go to this REST controller. We're going to do some minor tweaks to that so we can database enable this. So I'm going to, at this point, just inject private final product repository. I'll just call this repo. I'm going to inject that in the constructor. And then what I like to do, and this is not the only way you can do this is just the best way. I'm kidding. It's the way I like to do it, and I have reasons for it. But what I like to do is create a post-construct method for my data loading, because in production, you typically don't have that, right? You're not going to load data every time you start an application in production. But what I can do at this point, I'll just call this load data, and what I can do when I don't want this to run, I just comment it. So that's kind of the way I like to do things, but your mileage may vary, it's fine. And I'm going to take this wonderful code that Ryan's written, and I'm going to reuse that, because it seems a shame to waste that, right? So I'm just going to take that and put that up here. I'm not going to return anything, obviously, because it's a void, but what I am going to do is just do a repo save all, and I'm going to pass in that listing of products here. Now, I do think we could do a little better here, Ryan. I mean, I don't want to pick at you here, but I mean, we've got some serious shortcomings here with these products. I think we should be able to do better. So let's see if we can improve this a little bit. So let's change this to Star Trek USS Enterprise. See, now isn't that better? Yeah, I see the crowd agrees. Yes, okay, so
everyone has their bias.
So Star Trek, let's see the Romulan bird of prey. right? Looking better already by the moment. Star Trek, Klingon, Battle, Cruiser, Kapla. Okay, so we're good. We've got that saved. All we need to do now at this point is just make sure that we return what we're asking for. So return repo.findAll. And of course, since findAll returns an iterable, all we're going to do is just write to the interface and not the implementation. And there we go. Now, hopefully, well, it's right down here, right? So hopefully, we have completed our service connector creation, which is just introducing again the app to the database and vice versa. So we're going to take that, and at this point, I'm just going to cd into Toys Bestseller. I'm going to do a Maven clean package, and we'll build our application. And this is the new app with our changes, right? And once again, since we've kind of gone through this before, I'm going to cheat just a smidge. ASA. It's a little sluggish. There we go. Oh, it's right there, okay. And I'm going to borrow this command. Now, the reason we put this here is because if you try this at home, which we would encourage you to do, is you get like X amount of free usage to try this out and kick the tires, that you can just copy paste this and it should be off and running. So I'm going to deploy that, and then if all goes well, this should work. Now, while that's deploying, I'm going to turn this back over to Ryan because we actually want to see what's going on behind the scenes, and there's obviously a way to do that. There has to be, right? Because we have to see what's happening when it's happening.
Thanks, Mark. So that's some awesome enhancements to my mediocre code you made.
Toys, all the Star Trek toys.
So you can see here it's uploading a package to Blob. And basically all that means is taking the jar that was built when Mark did Maven clean package, and it's uploading it to ASAE. So this is where we kind of start to introduce some of the cool components here that are we have to assist you in making production as smooth as development. And the first one here is build service. And so when that build is running, that jar has been uploaded, there is a Tanzu build service which is actually taking that jar and building it into a container for us. So you can see some of this actually happening in the logs. You can see this build pack thing, lots of logging that's going to be spit out here. And basically what the build service is doing is it's taking that jar, it's using cloud native build packs to package that thing into a container. And the reason why we choose to do that with cloud native build packs is because it's going to apply all those optimizations and security best practices and all that fun stuff that you have to try and remember when you build a Docker container that no one ever remembers to do. Or at least I can't remember to do with my meager brain.
By the way, you know how much YAML you have to write to do that?
Yeah, a lot.
Zero.
And so it's going to do that all for us, and then it's going to take that container and it's going to actually run the application. So the good news for you guys is that, and girls, is that I have already deployed the other ones, right? So we don't have to do this four times. But as we can see, the Toys Bestseller application is in the midst of running, and so we can maybe even try and catch some of the logs of that happening in this other window here, maybe. And we can actually see some of the logs from the application starting up. There we go. So those are the Spring Boot logs being spit out there. And so this allows us to, like I said, these apps are all up and running. So like if I go here, we have some test URLs we can use to make sure that they're working, right? So we have our Hot Deals application working here. And so we can be able to test that Toys Bestseller once it looks like it's deployed. Yep, there we go, cool. So we can make sure that this is all now also working. And as Mark has added that database and made that connection, we now get all this data, and it's coming from the database in Azure, the Cosmos DB database that we have created beforehand. Which is really nice. So that was super easy to do. Now, one of the things that you remember us talking about in the beginning is we were using the config server here, right? To externalize configuration somewhere in here. Right there. And so we need that externalized configuration here in ASAE, right? In the cloud, right? We have something that's very similar to the config server called the application config service here. And this is actually, uses a lot of the components from the open source Spring Cloud config server, but it does things in a little bit different way. So if you're familiar with the Spring Cloud config server, normally you have your config server, you have your config client, the config client makes an HTTP request to the config server, it fetches its configuration, and then it loads it up, right? In we have to do things a little bit differently here in ASAE because we're using Kubernetes. And the way Kubernetes typically does externalized configuration is it mounts that configuration as a volume inside the container. And that's exactly what this application configuration service does. But it has a lot of influence from the Spring Cloud config server. So if we go to the settings here, I've already set this up. We can see that our config service is set to point at our GitHub repo that our config server was using. And more specifically, it's inside this directory here. We have a single application YAML file for our configuration. And so here we have in SAE, we point at the GitHub URL. We say we want to use the main branch. We want to look inside this directory, and we want you to serve up this application .yaml file. And so once you have your settings set up for your config service, then you just need to bind, much like Mark bound the database to the application so that we could use the database, you need to bind the application configuration service to the application so it can use those configuration files and mount those configuration files. So we have all the apps bound, and then the app itself needs to say, okay, I'm bound to the application configuration service. I can pick and choose what kind of configuration I want to use. And so inside the app, we've also said, I want to mount whatever. Here we'll see the application config file gets mounted inside the app, right? So when that's done, we can go back and see that is actually working. If we go to the actuator, the environment endpoint for the actuator, we're going to scroll way down at the bottom here, somewhere eventually. We'll get there. I promise. All right, we did it. All right, there it is. So this is the application.yaml file that actually got mounted from the application configuration service, and these are the properties all inside that file. I'll also point out while we're here, because right next to it this is the properties that got set when Mark made the connection between the database and the application. So you can see it set the Mongo data properties to connect to that database automatically for us, right? So that's configuration, that's externalized configuration in ASAE. The other thing you remember that we were using is service registry, right? So if we remember our all items service, this would only be working if we were able to look up the location of the other services, right? So we see we get all our data back here. And we didn't disable anything. We deployed the jars using Eureka and all that fun stuff, and just it worked. So how did that actually work, right? Well, there's another component here called service registry, and under the covers this is actually running a Eureka server, right? And just like with the application configuration service and the database, we have to bind the apps to the service registry in order for them to take advantage of it. So we have all of our apps bound to the service, and that means in the act of doing that, then ASAE sets a property to say, okay, here's the location of your Eureka server that you need to use. So again, if we look at, not here, if we look in the actuator endpoint here for Eureka, not that one, there's one that would get overridden here, here it is. So when we bind the application to the service registry, again, ASAE injects this configuration property to set the location of the Eureka server for applications to use. And so it's now sending requests to register itself with that Eureka server, and then can look up other services that might be using that service registry as well.
And you see a consistent thread here because once you define these externally, then it injects it into the application, these properties. And again, if you have to make any changes, push an update to your application, well, I mean, you're not having to make code changes. You refresh, you change where it's connecting to, and you refresh it, and then it's off and running. So you eliminate this long deploy cycle that typically happens anytime there needs to be a change in location of a database, or something changes with your service registry or something like that. Exactly. And that's consistent throughout all the services, the infrastructure services.
Yep. And so the final piece that we were also using from Spring Cloud was Spring Cloud Gateway, right? And if you guys are familiar with using the open source version of the Spring Cloud Gateway, you normally configure that either in your Java code or with configuration properties. Because this is a hosted version of the Spring Cloud Gateway, things are configured a little bit differently. Obviously, you can't set Java properties on the hosted version, right? So you have to configure it a little bit differently. And the way we do it in ASAE is by using some JSON files. And so I'll show you, again, because there's never enough time, I've written those already for you. And they all look the same for the different services, but basically all the routes and predicates and filters, the filters and predicates that you're familiar with from the open source version of the Spring Cloud Gateway are available to use here, but the way you just configure them and configure your routes is by using a little bit of a JSON file here. So our routes all look pretty much the same. They have a single predicate, which is the path, and then the method that it's going to match on, the HTTP method it's going to match on, in this case is a get. And they all use the strip prefix filter because by default it's going to strip the prefix from the route, and in this case we want to leave them on or else the downstream application is not going to know what you're talking about. So we set it to 0 instead of the default is 1. So we have to use that filter. But you can configure any other predicate or any other filter that you'd like from Spring Cloud Gateway using these JSON files. And so we have to tell the gateway about this. And so I'm going to cheat here just like Mark did a little bit earlier. I'm going to copy some commands here to actually...
Oh, move out of the directory.
Oh, yeah, because we made that mistake a million times when we were practicing, or I made that mistake. And this is going to, I'll explain exactly what it's going to do here. Basically, what these commands do is say, I want you to create a route. Here's the name, right? You can call it whatever you want. We have our resource group and service, which are not particularly interesting. And I want this route to point at this app, right? And here's the file that I want you to use to create that route. And by doing this, then this configuration then gets applied here under the routing rules. So if we refresh this here, we will get we should see our routing rules kind of populated there, which is really cool. And now we have a publicly accessible endpoint for people to reach our application. So if we go here and we go to /start page, maybe
it hadn't finished.
Yeah, it's still doing its thing.
Yep.
I'm too fast. Let's try one of the other services in a second, and we'll come back to that. And so we see fashion bestseller, or we can get the toys service here as well. Toys. All right, and then we have /start page. There we go.
Sweet.
You can see the circuit breaker working here, the fallback here. Also that's still working. I know we're getting a little short in time, but I want Mark to show you a really cool thing. One other thing that ASAE or Azure provides to us that's really important for developers running applications in the cloud.
Yeah, there are a couple or three things that we'd really like to show you in the last few minutes. Gosh, there's just never enough time. But hey, well, you know, it is what it is, right? So what I'm going to do is go down to application insights because frequently, I mean, we're problem solvers, right? Or we wouldn't have gone into software development. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all of our efforts are equal and all of our efforts are equally productive, right? So that's why I mentioned earlier, it's always better to be able to deploy much needed functionality for your users than it is to troubleshoot why you have a spacing error in your YAML file. It's not that stuff isn't important, but if you can find ways to make that, again, where the platform does that work for you, you can focus on the stuff that is a higher level of importance. So when it comes to troubleshooting, when things don't go as well as you'd like, or when they just out and out break, it's good to be able to drill into things and find the problem and fix it and get back to the higher level of effort, higher level effort things that you, the higher payoff things that you could be doing. So if you go into Application Insights, which is just a capability within Azure Spring Apps, and you pull up the application map, what I like about this, and actually, let me do a refresh because that's not showing what I would hope. Yeah, okay, so things never go wrong in live demos, right? But anyway, so we can kind of see here, and I'm going to try to zoom this in without ruining everything. So we see that we're coming in through the all item service and making calls, right, to our fashion bestseller, to our hot deals, and to our toys bestseller. So this allows you to get a very quick and high level overview of what is happening in the time frame that's involved. So we see here that this may be a little bit of a longer call, and maybe we might want to look into that. We also see that we can isolate and go into the actual calls all the way down to the database. Again, time's short, so I'm going to drill into this particularly, and maybe we want to investigate the performance behind this. And then you can, and if you see particular, well, in this case, we only have a few transactions, but if you want to drill into those particular transactions, we have a sample in this case, which is, granted, in production, you're going to see several options, but you can drill in and take a look at all of these and go in even further and see the end-to-end trace. So if there's a problem, you can very quickly get to the bottom of what that problem is and isolate and resolve that problem and get back to the business at hand. The things that bring you joy and bring your users joy. I know we're really tight, and I want you to be able to show like the tracing, because if there isn't an issue with maybe your interactions with the data store, maybe it's an issue with your code. I know, it happens. There has to be a way to quickly isolate and find that without having to go through multiple rebuild, redeploy cycles, and Ryan's going to show you that next.
So the one last thing I want to show you real quickly here is we have some developer tools that are provided by, oh no, go back, I'm in the wrong spot. There we go. By Tanzu as well. So if we dive in here, we can see there's application live view. Come on, internet. There we go. And this is basically a visual representation of the actuator endpoints. And one of the things you can do here is take a look at the log levels. And so, like if Mark was showing, so we say we found some problems with the application insights. We know there's some tracing around that code that we want to enable. But lots of times when you go, you have to in order to do that, you have to redeploy the application. And the act of redeploying the application then just fixes the problem magically. You never know what's going on or how it actually ended up occurring. So this is really cool because you can enable logging. In this case, I can't spell. Spring Framework. In this case, I'm going to live dangerously and just enable trace logging for the entire org.spring framework on the toys bestseller. And this changes the logging level instantaneously. So if we go back here, we can see in our logs, we're already getting a bunch of trace and debug logging. So now I can dive into the traces and see the logging for maybe what might be going on without having to redeploy the application. And then when you're done doing that, you can go ahead and set everything back to the way it normally was, so you don't leave an app with trace logging on in production or something like that. So it's a really useful tool, and there's, like I said, all the other actuator endpoints are available for you under here that you can do as well. And we have 2 minutes, and I'm just going to show you one quick thing.
The API?
The API portal here.
Okay, good.
This is a very kind of like, it's integrated with the Spring Cloud Gateway, but lots of times when you have APIs and you have other teams that you might be working with, you want to give them a place for them to play around with their APIs and test them out and explore how they can be used. So you get this API portal that people can go to, and our APIs are very basic, but it's a very Swagger-like type of feel, right? You select your API, click try it out, click execute, and you get not only how the request was made, and then also the response that comes back as well. So it's a really good way for exploring a bunch of REST APIs that might be part of your application that you have running in ASAE. So somehow we've managed to squeeze that all in. And
the slide for the repo?
Oh yeah, yep.
Definitely want to.
Yeah. So if you guys want to check out the code, all the code that we showed today, and all the scripts that that we showed as well to make deployment easier are in that repo there. So you can go ahead and grab that, and like I said, if anyone has any questions afterwards or about the code or whatever, please reach out to me or Mark on Twitter. And we have 1 minute for live questions, but we're happy to take questions out in the hall afterwards because we got to be out of here in a minute.
I was going to say, if you have a question, great. If you think of it 10 minutes later, like I always do, it happens to me every time, reach out to us. We're happy to talk, discuss at length, either in the hallway or at one of the booths or on Twitter/X/whatever it is next week. But yeah, if you're not following us on Twitter, it's Ryan J. Baxter and MK Heck. Follow us, send us DMs. My DMs are open. I think Ryan's are too, and we're happy to talk. So if you have any questions now,
you gotta come up to the microphone.
Come up to the mic. If not, we'll see you in the hall. And if not, we'll see you on Twitter, X, whatever.
Or later on the conference.
Or email if you're a traditionalist. Email is fine.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks.